was a time when in prisoner of war camps, Americans were dying at the rate of 50 a day. This Sunday night, NBC Reports is showing at 7 o'clock Eastern Time a special program called Bataan, The Forgotten Hell. It details the infamous Death March and what happened to the prisoners. Here are some scenes from it, and we'll recall two men who survived.
Well, we were all frightened. We didn't know what to expect. We had heard that the Japanese had been very cruel, and yet I had hope that they would abide by the rules of the Geneva Convention, just an outside hope. And you felt, you felt so lost and hopeless, and you knew you were defeated, and you were at their mercy.
Men too weak to defend themselves were made to march in the heat of the Philippine summer, most of the 90 miles to O'Donnell prison camp. There were no rations. There was no water.
They took the weak ones, and most of these that I saw were Filipinos that were really very weak. They didn't wait for them to die. They just hit them with shovels, and they dug a mass grave and had other troops, American troops or Filipino troops, cover them up. And some of them were trying to fight to get out, and then they did either hit them with a shovel or bang at them.
Those two men are with us today. Lloyd Mills, who was a captain in the 57th Infantry, and Manny Lawton, who was also a captain, advisor to the Philippine Army. They were 23 years old at the time. Lloyd Dobbins, by the way, was the reporter. It is an incredible documentary, thanks to you gentlemen. The Death March was just the beginning, though. That's what we remember from the movies and so forth. How long from the Death March to your liberation?
3.5 years.
3.5 years? And yet you feel that the Death March itself was not the worst of it.
No. The Death March was a cakewalk compared to the prison ship trip to Japan.
Which happened 2 years later.
Yes, 47 days of travel from start to finish.
In the hold?
In the holds of
what
cargo
happened
ships.
In the hold?
Well, to begin with, Manila or the Philippines has a very hot climate. And imagine the sun bearing down on the steel sides of the ship. It made it feel like 120 degrees in there. I'm sure it must have been. And we were so crowded, there was no space to lie down. People drank their water almost immediately, their canteen of water, and got no more.
And were killing each other for water.
And when night came on, it was as dark as you can imagine, just pitch dark. And people panicked for water, for air, and went crazy. Some numbers of them lost their minds. And that first night, some became vampires and tried to cut others to drink their blood. This happened. I know some that it happened to.
Lloyd, how many of you were alive when the prison ship trip was over?
Well, actually, I think the 45-day trip was probably worse than all 1,248 days that I spent as a prisoner. And particularly on the second ship that took out Formosa. Unfortunately, I was in the forward hole, which got a direct hit. There were 500 of us in that hole. About 100 came out alive. The Japanese kept us there for 3 days, and I recall seeing friends of mine with their heads blown off, arms, legs, screaming for help, but we had no way to help them. And the Japanese kept us there for 3 days with the dead, and finally they put nets down, and we had to load the dead bodies up. And everybody was wounded one way or the other. And then the third ship, when we got into Moji, actually there were only approximately 400 of us left alive out of 1,600, and I think, to me, that was probably my lowest point.
You see, so many got pneumonia. When we left Formosa and got toward Japan, it was January, and we buried 25 a day over the side, mostly with pneumonia.
Are there 23-year-old men inside you that still suffer over this?
Well, when I first got back, I would say yes, but then as the years went by, I tried to forget that. And then it all came back when I was in the Philippines this year. I went back, and I met Daryl Murray and, of course, Jane Wilson, and they seemed to be so sincere in wanting to find out what happened. So I was able to tell them, which I'd kept into me inside all these years.
Manny, you say in the documentary that at one point you cried, or which proved to you, perhaps it was you, Lloyd? One of you. It was you, Manny? That it proved to you that you were still human.
Right.
Are you crying now? Do you often relive?
No. Fortunately, I've been able to throw it off completely. It's never bothered me emotionally. Well, of course, I get sentimental and a little emotional on certain subjects, but it's never been a problem for me, and I feel very fortunate for that.
You didn't talk about it for 25 years? Why not?
Well, I figured nobody would believe these things, you know. They were so unreal.
Nobody was interested, actually, I thought.
Your immediate family, yes.
What do you want people to know about it now?
Well, I think that probably the time has come that people should know what people had to go through to survive.
Sunday night at 7 o'clock Eastern Time, Lloyd Dobbins presents Bataan, the Forgotten Hell. And it is perhaps one of the most moving hours of television you'll see in a long time. We'll be back after station break.
It was hell. If there ever was hell, it was here.
They fired until the breech froze on the gun.
But we were nothing but animals trying to survive.
Unless you lived through these experiences, there's no way in God's green earth that they could understand it.
December 1941. Japan went to war. They needed oil and power. They called it Asia for the Asians. The Japanese seemed invincible. The white colonial masters were beaten into submission. Japanese forces consumed the enemy. Except here, the Bataan Peninsula and Corregidor Island in the Philippines. American and Filipino troops, all of them poorly equipped, most of them poorly trained, were supposed to crumble in 30 days. They held for 5 months. They fought when they were hungry, thirsty, exhausted, and held. They believed help was coming.
American and Filipino troops fighting in the jungles along a 200-mile defense arc are reported making a grim last-ditch stand. All available forces have now been united.
The 80,000 troops on that defensive arc had been driven back to the Bataan Peninsula as the Japanese took control of the main Philippine island of Luzon. The 1942 radio report did not say that 80,000 men now existed in a steamy, malaria-infested jungle with little food, water, or medicine, and were fighting with their backs to the wall. Using World War I weapons, they fought the most modern war machine in the Pacific, with predictable results. But they were only holding on, Help was on the way. Washington had promised it any day now. Their fighting spirit was fed only by rumor. The troops were on their own. There weren't going to be any reinforcements. There weren't going to be any supplies. Rations were cut to half, then to a third. The men ate what they could find. First the cavalry's horses, then the quartermaster's mules, then water buffalo, monkey, snake, lizard, whatever they could find, but it wasn't enough.
Oh, yeah, see, we ate up the cavalry. We'd laugh and joke about it. Now we've eaten the cavalry. What are we going to do next?
Next, they got sick. Exhausted, hungry men in 100-degree temperatures without medical help. More men died of disease than were killed in battle, many more. The Americans and Filipinos held on. February 8, 1942, 2 months after he landed, General Masahari Homa called off the attack. He had lost 7,000 men. The Japanese pulled back to wait for reinforcements, battle-hardened veterans from the victory at Singapore. The Americans just waited. March 11th, General MacArthur was ordered to Australia, and General Jonathan Wainwright took command of what was left. Headquarters was on Corregidor Island. In the worst of it, General Wainwright went from position to position talking to his men. When his aides insisted that he take cover from the constant enemy fire, he refused. He said he had nothing left to give his men. He had no food, no water, no ammunition, no equipment, no supplies. All he had left was morale. Just morale. General Homa could have starved the defenders into submission, but Tokyo's orders were to destroy them in combat, to demonstrate Asian superiority. His reinforced troops got ready. Five days after the attack stopped, General Homa's troops were ready. It was April 3rd, 1942, Good Friday. The Japanese wanted the high ground at Mount Summit. They got it. It was April 9th, 1942. 76,000 American and Filipino troops surrendered to the Japanese in the largest single capitulation in American history. Some of the men made it to Corregidor. Hundreds of others died trying. For a while, the troops on Corregidor remained free to fight if they could, not on Bataan. On Bataan, they were prisoners of a brutal army.
Well, we were all frightened. We didn't know what to expect. We had heard that the Japanese had been very cruel, and yet I had hope that they would abide by the rules of the Geneva Convention, just an outside hope. And you felt so lost and hopeless, and you knew you were defeated, and you were at their mercy.
American and Filipino troops who had survived had been herded together here to be marched to Japanese prison camps. They could not have known, but before the trip was over, the trip they were to make would be called the Bataan Death March. What happened here was, in part at least, a clash in cultures. Japanese soldiers had been taught that to die in battle was honor, to surrender was disgrace. So anyone captive had to be something less than worthwhile. The Japanese plan for handling prisoners fell apart. They had captured 3 times as many men as they thought they would, and those men weren't healthy. They were diseased and half-starved. Men too weak to defend themselves were made to march in the heat of the Philippine summer, most of the 90 miles to O'Donnell prison camp. There were no rations.
The death march began approximately at Mariveles on the bottom of the Bataan Peninsula and went to a town called San Fernando, Pampanga. And there they put us in freight cars.
My God, people had dysentery. There was no place for them to go except on you. And you had very little air to breathe.
And of course the steel side with the sun bearing in there made it feel like an oven, and we were packed so closely together that if anybody fainted or died, he just stayed in place. He couldn't even fall down, you know.
I don't imagine over 80 of us came out of that boxcar. There must have been at least 20 died.
About 10,000 American and Filipino troops died on the Bataan Death March. 10,000. May 4th, 1942, the worst day. 16,000 artillery shells hit Corregidor Island. That's one every 5 seconds for 24 hours. Survivors said it felt like one continuous earthquake. The last big gun, Battery Gary, was destroyed. Troops from Corregidor joined the Death March survivors in prison camps like O'Donnell. Each water spigot was shared by 1,500 men. Each fish head by 10. Any rat they could catch was a meal for 20. And if they got sick, they died. Some just gave up and died.
You will bow to every Japanese soldier, private or officer, you will bow and salute him. This was the way we were greeted.
Manny Lawton, who had hoped the Geneva Convention on the treatment of prisoners would be obeyed, learned immediately that it would not be. The Japanese refused to recognize the Western concept of honorable surrender.
We had to stand for at least an hour while a little squatty Japanese sat up on a platform there and shouted at us and told us that we were not prisoners of war, that we were captives. He degraded us in saying that the Japanese soldier never surrendered.
And he let us know that we were at the bottom of the totem pole in this world, that we were nothing. There was no medicine. We had our doctors, but they didn't have any medicine for us. And they designated one building as a hospital, but they only put them there to die. When I got within 100 yards of that place, I could smell it. I could smell the filth, and I could smell the death.
If you got sick and you were sent into the hospital, they didn't increase your food or give you medicine to build you back up where you could go back to work. They cut your rations. So you fought not to get into the hospital. And many times I've gone out on work details with a temperature of 106 or higher, because I knew that if I went into the hospital, I would die.
You know, dying to some of these people was just, you know, boy, getting out of this. It was a way of getting out.
During the first few weeks at O'Donnell, 50 American prisoners died every day. So did 500 Filipinos.
Survival is a hell of a thing in a man, and everybody wants to survive. And that's the point that I was always thinking about. If there was one son of a bitch that was going to come out of this thing, it was going to be me.
You had to fight with every fiber, every minute, every hour, every day, to struggle to stay alive.
Staying alive meant getting more food, buy it, trade or gamble for it, steal it from the Japanese, or, when all else failed, from each other. Not all you wanted, just enough to live. 4 months after they were captured, the Filipinos were released. 27,000 had died at Camp O'Donnell. By the end of 1942, 5,000 Americans had died in Philippine prison camps. For some, the best chance to survive seemed to be escape. But that meant others would die. Prisoners watched each other because for everyone who escaped, the Japanese executed 10 who remained behind. August 1944. American bombers hit the Philippines for the first time. It was a fact, not a rumor. With naval guns and General MacArthur pounding at the door, the Japanese sent the prisoners to Japan, slaves of the Japanese war effort. Manny Lawton and Lloyd Mills waited on a sun-baked pier for hours. Then, with 1,600 others, they were packed in the holds of the Oryoku Maru. December 13th, 1944, the ship sails.
It was stifling for lack of air, and it was hot. The fellows who drank up their water immediately started yelling for water. Water, we want water. And the interpreter, Mr. Water, said, "Shut up. If you don't shut up, I will close the hatches and we don't have no water. You'll get no water."
I was trying to control my little canteen of water, and I was even afraid to take a sup out of it, afraid somebody would jump me.
People began to go mad from thirst and from panic.
They were killing each other for a want of water, trying to steal other canteens of water that men had. And some of them went so far as to drink urine. It was almost indescribable to discuss how a person can turn into an animal, forget that he's a human, actually. That we were nothing but animals, trying to survive, trying to get water to live.
And they became vampires, trying to cut their companions and drink their blood. Now this happened, it happened to a friend of mine. I noticed that his arms were slashed, both arms, not deep cuts, but cuts. And I said, "Al, what's happened to you?" And he said, "Well, last night, one of those crazy fellas was trying to cut my arms to drink my blood, and said I fought him off for some time, maybe an hour, and then two fellas next to me realized what was going on. And one of them grabbed him and held him, and the other took his canteen and beat him to death." And he said, "That's what saved me."
The next morning they did open the hatches, and some of the people started up and they were shot by the Japanese. They were completely mad. They wanted to get out of the hole.
The prison ships, and there were several of them, were not marked. So to an American submarine, they looked like Japanese freighters. About 5,000 American prisoners died in these attacks.
And the next morning, our Navy found us again, our airplanes. They bombed this convoy. There were several ships in the convoy, and they got the other ships, and then they started on us.
The first thing that I thought, my God, hit us. I wanted them to hit us. I wanted to end it right then. I said, I was saying to myself, hit us. Let's get this thing over with.
A bomb made a direct hit, and it killed about 100 to 150 people.
Still near the Philippines, the Japanese abandoned the Oryoku Maru. Prisoners were ordered to swim the 300 yards to shore.
I know we spent Christmas Day on the shore at Lingayen Gulf, hungry, thirsty, discouraged, and you know, just a desolate thing. And you knew that you were going to be sent to Japan. You knew there was no turning back now.
We were issued one rice ball per man. That was our Christmas dinner. And the next morning, we were loaded up on what had been a horse boat or a cattle boat.
And we got then to Formosa. And after several days, we heard a plane coming.
And we were hit by our own planes.
Shrapnel flying. Half of our number dead.
Then it was worse, really, than the Oryoku Maru. You'd look around and there would be somebody standing there minus a head, or sitting there, I'm sorry, minus a head. Others screaming minus a leg or an arm. No medicine, begging for you to do something and help them, and there was nothing you could do. But to stay down there, we were just lost all sense of comprehending anything. Actually, we're there with all these dead bodies, no food, no water, nothing for 3 days. And we were then transferred to a third ship. About 800 of us left out of the 1,600.
On their third ship, the prisoners who had survived the first two got 2 teaspoons of water and an ounce of rice each day. That was better. The weather was worse.
Very shortly, we were in cold waters, and before long, we ran into snow, and the deck got iced over, and it was freezing cold in there. Then pneumonia set in after we got to colder climate approaching Japan. We began burying 25 a day over the side. We left Manila with 1,618 prisoners, and we finally got to Japan 45 days later with something less than 400, I think about 375.
I was hardly able to move by that time, and for the first time in all the years, I'd begin to lose my sense of optimistic outlook, and I felt, well, you're just not going to make it, Lord. This is going to be it. But by the time I got that feeling, we landed in Moji, and I couldn't walk off the ship. We had some Australians there working on the dock, and one of them carried me off the ship. I'll never forget, they were very friendly and so husky. To me, it looked like a giant, because I only weighed 80 pounds, so he could just pick me up and like I was a baby. And they put me in it. I didn't know it at the time, but they put me in the death barracks.
By early 1945, Japan was being battered from the air. American prisoners were starting their 4th year in captivity.
If it hadn't have been for the guy next to me, who was a corpsman, I wouldn't be talking to you now. They brought the rice in, and I told him, I said, would you get my rice for me? He said, no way. He said, I'm not going to take care of you. He said, you're going to be dead tomorrow anyway. He started laughing. And the more he laughed, the madder I got. And I got up and I started walking a little bit more each day. And I got to where I could move around, and I got outside to where I could go to work. And then I started coming back. And this Corpsman, he said, you know, if I hadn't gotten you mad, you wouldn't have made it, and I knew it.
Those who had made it this far had paid an awful price. They had lived as animals, worked as slaves. Their bodies were ruined, their minds dulled. They wondered whether, if they did survive and get home, they would ever be human again.
You know, in the outside world, a death of somebody that's close to you affects you very, very strongly. But after you see so many die, and they're dead people, they're corpses all around you, you become hardened to it. And it doesn't bother you, strangely enough. And you have to get hardened to it, or it would upset you terribly. And I guess we sort of all did that. But after we got to Japan, my good friend Henry Leitner developed pneumonia, double pneumonia. Henry just had a very high fever. And I looked up one morning, he was going out the doorway with his canteen cup in his hand, and I called to him and said, Henry, where are you going? He said, man, I'm dehydrated. I've got to have some of that snow. About a foot of snow on the ground. And I begged him to come back. I said, Henry, you can't stand that cold. Yeah, he said, I'm burning up. I've just got to cool down. So I guess that aggravated his pneumonia, and that night he died. His death brought me back to reality. While it was a sad, it did one thing for me. It made me realize I could cry.
They said bomb. We thought they meant bombs.
And it destroyed a whole city.
3 days later, Nagasaki got it.
The Emperor has ordered the forces to surrender. The war is over.
The war's over.
We were regaining our freedom. You can't describe it.
Gradually, it got sorted out. Prisoners were sent home. The Japanese were disarmed. The pieces were picked up. The Japanese conquest ended. The surrender papers were signed. It would never be the same, but at least the other side had to do the bowing. And instead of the court-martial General Wainwright had feared all those years, there were cheers. And in Washington, with some of his fellow survivors looking on, General Wainwright got the Congressional Medal of Honor and his 4th star from President Truman. Wainwright and all the others got one thing more: $1 a day for each day as a prisoner. $1.
I had a news reporter interview me on the boat coming back, and he asked me a specific question. Was it really as bad as they had heard? And my only answer to him was that if the truth were ever known and given out, the attitude of the American people is they wouldn't believe it.
How would they possibly know what we went through? There's no way they could. How could I tell them about walking around for 3 years with nothing but a G-string on and hoping that I could get one handful of rice to survive that one day. And yet what was keeping me alive was the will to live. I wanted to live. I wanted to survive. I wanted to come home. And you can't explain this to people. Unless you live through these experiences, there's no way in God's green earth that they could understand it.
Outside Manila, there is an American military cemetery, the largest one in the Pacific. In the memorial, the names of those killed in the Pacific during World War II are listed. There are 36,000 of them. They are the ones whose bodies were never recovered. World War II is long ago. 42% of Americans today weren't even born when Bataan and Corregidor fell. But if they came here, they might find their family name. Perhaps we ought to remember better than we do, but the world moves on. After the war, we needed the Japanese as allies against the Soviet Union. Japan was rebuilt. We buried our dead, passed out some medals, a little money, and moved on. In Europe during World War II, 1% of the American prisoners died. In the Pacific, 57% died. All of this is history, largely forgotten. All that remains is personal triumph.
You ask about heroes. There's no definition for that. But I think one of the greatest words in the English language is survivor. And that's what we are as survivors.